Welcome to Wisdom for the Present, where we take ancient truth and bring it into clear, modern understanding. This episode uses AI-generated narration based on human-researched and written material. So, usually when we talk about a medical diagnosis, there's this expectation of, absolute precision.
Right, it's very binary.
Exactly. Like engineering or something, you break your arm, the x-ray shows that jagged white line, and the doctor just points at the screen and says, well, there it is.
Broken or not broken. Very clean.
Clean. And frankly, it's comforting. We really like things to be visible, to be neatly categorized. We want a clear-cut problem so we can apply a clear-cut solution.
Oh, I also like.
But then, you step into the world of human behavior or societal collapse or personal transformation, and suddenly that x-ray machine is just completely useless.
Yeah, it doesn't work at all.
You're trying to diagnose why a culture is fracturing or why a person keeps repeating the exact same destructive mistakes. And the diagnostic landscape is, well, honestly, it's incredibly murky.
It is the absolute definition of diagnostic muddy waters.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, there's no single jagged white line to point to.
Right.
You're dealing with generations of trauma, ingrained habits, systemic failures, and just deeply rooted psychological blind spots.
It's a mess.
It is. And that complex, tangled web of human dysfunction is exactly where we find ourselves as we open up the sources for today's deep dive.
We are diving into the ancient text of Ezekiel, specifically chapters 33 through 39, and we've got a really fantastic stack of sources on the table today.
We do. We're leaning heavily on the classical, deeply analytical commentaries by Albert Barnes and Matthew Henry.
But before we get into the actual chapters, we need to set the scene, because this isn't just, an abstract philosophical treatise written in some comfortable ivory tower. This is survival literature.
Survival literature. That's actually the perfect way to phrase it. It's raw. To really understand the weight of these chapters, you have to imagine the audience.
Okay, what is there?
So Ezekiel is speaking to the Israelites around 586 BCE, and they are in exile in Babylon. They have been forcibly marched across the ancient Near East, just ripped away from their homes, their economy, their entire way of life.
And as chapter 33 opens, the absolute worst-case scenario materializes. A refugee, literally covered in dust, arrives at the exile camp with catastrophic news.
The worst news possible.
Jerusalem, their capital city, the center of their religious and cultural identity, has been completely destroyed by the Babylonian army. The temple is ashes. The walls are rubble.
And the psychological toll of that moment, it really cannot be overstated.
It must have been devastating.
Utterly. Up until that refugee arrived, the exiles still had this tiny sliver of hope. They thought, well, we're here in Babylon, but at least Jerusalem's still standing.
Right, eventually we'll go back.
Exactly. But when that news hits, it severs their very last tether to their identity.
Yeah.
They're profoundly defeated, experiencing just a total existential despair.
Just completely untethered.
Yeah. They're wondering if they have a future at all, or if they're just going to, disappear into the melting pot of the Babylonian Empire and be totally forgotten by history.
So that's the atmosphere. It's thick with grief, anger, and confusion. And as you listen today, I want you to see this text not as some dusty ancient history lesson, but as a mirror for your own 21st century realities.
Because the parallels are there.
They really are. Because when we hit a wall, whether it's a massive personal failure, a career completely derailing, or looking around at a deeply fractured modern society, we ask the exact same questions these exiles did.
How did we get here? Who is to blame?
Exactly. And how on earth do we rebuild when everything feels like ashes?
The author's response to that despair is fascinating, because he doesn't start by promising that everything will magically get better.
No, he doesn't.
He starts by radically redefining personal responsibility. The text introduces this concept of the prophet as a watchman over Israel.
Let's unpack that watchman metaphor, because it is intense. In the ancient world, the watchman was literally the guy standing on the highest tower of the city wall, or on the border of the territory.
Right, highly visible.
And his singular job was to scan the horizon. If he sees an invading army or a sword coming upon the land, he has to blow a trumpet to warn everyone.
And the stakes in this text are laid out with chilling clarity. The rules are absolute.
Yeah, there's no gray area here.
None. If the watchman sees the sword coming and he blows the trumpet, but the people in the city ignore the warning, their blood is on their own heads. The watchman is innocent.
He did his job.
Exactly. But if the watchman gets lazy or scared or just decides not to blow the trumpet and the sword comes and kills someone.
The text says that person is taken away in their iniquity, but their blood will be required at the watchman's hand.
Right. That is a staggering level of accountability.
It really is. If I translate that into a modern context, I immediately think of like a cybersecurity analyst at a massive financial firm who spots a vulnerability in the network.
Oh, that's a great comparison.
Or a corporate whistleblower who realizes the company's new drug has lethal side effects. Or even just a medical professional looking at a patient's blood work.
Yes, you see the data.
You see the threat coming.
Yeah.
And your entire moral obligation is to sound the alarm.
And this introduces a massive shift in the theological framework of the time. Because, the people in exile were complaining.
Oh, they were whining big time.
They really were. They were essentially saying the way of the Lord is not equal, meaning God is being unfair.
Well, why are we paying for this?
Exactly. They said, we are being punished as a collective for things our ancestors did. The kings before us messed up, and now we're stuck in Babylon paying the bill.
They wanted to blame their environment, their history, their leaders, which is, frankly, such a human reaction.
Oh, totally.
We say, it's not my fault, it's the system, it's my genetics, it's how I was raised. We do the exact same thing today.
Precisely. But the text aggressively counters this narrative. It moves completely away from collective national punishment to acute, terrifyingly personal accountability.
It zooms right in on the individual.
It does. The commentary by Matthew Henry points out that the watchman is not just predicting unavoidable doom. The warning is conditional.
That's a key point.
Yeah, the watchman isn't saying, you all going to die tomorrow, end of story. The warning is, you are on a path that leads to destruction. Turn around.
The goal is prevention.
Right. The text actually quotes God pleading with them. He says, why will ye die, O house of Israel? I have no pleasure in the death of the wicked.
So the message is, your past does not have to dictate your future. The text explicitly says that past righteousness won't save you if you suddenly decide to commit atrocities today.
Right. No lifetime passes.
You don't get a pass because you were a good person 10 years ago. But conversely, and this is the beautiful part, past wickedness does not prevent future redemption. You are not locked in.
It's a radical affirmation of human agency. You are entirely responsible for your present choices.
Okay, well, let me push back on this a little bit, because it sounds very clean in theory. But let's look at the watchman's reality for a second.
Okay, go for it.
Isn't it incredibly exhausting to be responsible for warning people who blatantly, stubbornly do not want to listen?
Oh, absolutely.
I mean, think about trying to talk a loved one out of a toxic relationship or warning a friend about a terrible financial investment. You blow the trumpet, they roll their eyes, and they do the destructive thing anyway. It is the definition of burnout.
It leads straight to burnout, which is exactly why the text draws a very specific boundary. The text says that if the watchman blows the trumpet and the people don't listen, the watchman has delivered his soul.
He's free.
He is free from the guilt.
Yeah.
I think that's a profound psychological release for anyone in a caretaking or leadership role today.
Yeah, you did your part.
You are responsible to the people, but you are not responsible for their ultimate choices. You cannot control their agency. You can only control whether you have the courage to blow the trumpet.
That is such a crucial distinction. We carry so much guilt when people we care about make bad choices. But the text is saying, your job is clarity, not coercion.
Yes. But, there's a flip side to the watchman's burnout.
Oh.
What happens when you're blowing the trumpet perfectly? The people are listening, they are nodding along, taking notes, and then they do absolutely nothing.
Ah, right.
Ezekiel actually experienced this, and it leads to one of the most blistering critiques of human psychology in the entire ancient world.
Oh, this is the lovely song Illusion. We're at the end of chapter 33 now. Ezekiel is giving these life or death warnings. He is pouring his soul out.
And the people love it.
Right. The text describes the people coming to him in droves. They sit before him. They are highly attentive. They show, quote, much love with their mouths. They listen to his words with great respect.
But then the text drops this devastating hammer. It says, to the people. Ezekiel is just a very lovely song of one who has a pleasant voice and can play well on an instrument.
Just background music.
Right. They hear his words, but their hearts go after their covetousness. They do not change a single action.
They are treating a life or death warning like a Spotify playlist.
Exactly. Matthew Henry's commentary unpacks the sheer hypocrisy of this. He calls it the tragedy of hollow religion.
Passive consumption.
It's the passive consumption of truth without yielding subjection to it. The people are using the prophet's profound, challenging warnings as a diversion, a pretty amusement for an hour or two.
Wow.
They want to feel spiritual. They want to feel like they're engaging with deep ideas without the friction of actual transformation.
I read this and I immediately thought, this is the exact definition of modern infotainment.
Oh, 100%.
Think about the multi-billion-dollar self-help industry. We binge-watch documentaries on minimalism while ordering junk we don't need online.
Yes, the irony.
We listen to hours of profound content, and yes, the irony of us critiquing this on a deep dive is not lost on me at all. But we nod along to a brilliant TED Talk, we share a quote on social media, we say, wow, so deep, that really resonates with me. And then we close the laptop and change absolutely nothing about how we speak to our spouses, how we manage our stress, or how we spend our money.
It's because our brains play a trick on us. In the 21st century, we suffer from a massive illusion of competence. We experience a dopamine hit when we learn a new concept.
It feels good to learn it.
It feels great. We equate consuming information about personal growth with the act of actually growing.
It's like reading a cookbook cover to cover and telling yourself you've eaten a nutritious dinner. You're still starving, but you feel like a chef.
That's a really great way to put it. The people sitting in front of Ezekiel felt like they were doing the work just by being in the room. They thought proximity to wisdom was the same as possessing wisdom.
But the text warns that this is a dangerous self-deception.
Exactly. The prophet's words were meant to be a surgical tool to cut away their destructive habits, but the people turned the scalpel into a toy.
A toy. That's haunting.
And the chilling conclusion of this section is that when the reality of the words finally hits, when the consequences of their inaction arrive, then they will know a prophet was among them, but the opportunity for change will have passed.
So how do we, the listeners, break this lovely song illusion? How do we stop confusing consumption with action?
It takes work.
It does. I think we need to institute something I call the rule of one. We consume so much content every single day. The rule is, for every piece of profound wisdom you consume, you force yourself to take one concrete physical action in the real world before you allow yourself to consume the next piece of content.
I like that.
If you read an article about the importance of active listening, don't just retweet it. Put your phone in a drawer and go have a 10-minute conversation with your kid where you actually practice it. Make the wisdom a verb. Break the illusion.
That requires immense intentionality. And it brings us to a really fascinating pivot in the text. Because if individual accountability and breaking the illusion of passive consumption are the first steps for the ordinary person, we also have to look up the hierarchy.
Right. The leaders.
What happens when the individuals are trying to do the right thing, but the overarching systems are designed to crush them? The author shifts his focus in chapter 34 to a blistering indictment of the nation's leadership.
He holds nothing back here. Chapter 34 is a direct attack on the shepherds of Israel. And just to clarify for our listeners, Albert Barnes points out in his commentary that shepherd isn't referring to literal guys out in the field with sheep.
No, not at all.
In the ancient Near East, the title shepherd was a very common archetype for kings, magistrates, priests, and political rulers.
Yes, the Assyrian kings frequently referred to themselves as shepherds. It was an archetype meant to convey protection, guidance, and provision. The shepherd's entire existence was supposed to be dedicated to the flourishing of the flock.
Supposed to be.
Right. But Ezekiel points out that the leaders of Israel have completely inverted this archetype. They aren't protecting the flock, they are preying on it.
The charges against them are brutal. The text says, "Woe be to the shepherds of Israel that do feed themselves. Should not the shepherds feed the flocks?"
They're taking it all for themselves.
Yeah. It says, "Ye eat the fat, and ye clothe you with the wool. Ye kill them that are fed, but ye feed not the flock." He goes on to say they haven't strengthened the diseased, they haven't healed the sick, they haven't bound up the broken, and they haven't bothered to look for the ones that were driven away.
They are extracting wealth from the vulnerable rather than providing security. It's the definition of parasitic leadership.
Parasitic, yes.
And as a result of their greed, the flock is scattered and becomes meat for every beast of the field. The vulnerables are entirely exposed because the people hired to build the fences were too busy feasting.
So what does God do?
God's response to this is dramatic and unequivocal. He essentially fires the entire leadership class. He says, "I am against the shepherds," and he promises to rescue his flock from their mouths.
God promises to step in and be the true shepherd, which theologically points toward a future messianic figure, a servant David, who will establish a covenant of peace.
Right, that future hope.
But before we get to that hopeful future, The text does something incredibly insightful. It doesn't just blame the guys at the absolute top of the pyramid. It doesn't just blame the king. It also indicts a group it calls the rams and he-goats.
This is one of the most sociologically astute parts of the book. Matthew Henry details how the rams and he-goats represent the strong, wealthy, influential members of the society itself.
The upper middle class, the elite citizens.
Exactly. The corporate bosses. These privileged individuals aren't just eating the good pasture and drinking the deep, clear waters. The text says they intentionally trample the residue with their feet, and they intentionally muddy the remaining water.
It's not enough for them to have the best. They actively ensure the weak have nothing. The text describes them pushing with their sides and shoulders, thrusting with their horns to scatter the diseased. It's an ancient condemnation of systemic exploitation and artificial scarcity.
They're using their sheer mass and influence to monopolize resources.
When I look at the modern world, the parallels are almost too on the nose. We see this in toxic workplace cultures where managers take credit for their team's work while throwing them under the bus to save themselves.
Or corporate greed.
Exactly. An executive board taking massive, multi-million-dollar bonuses while simultaneously laying off thousands of workers and stripping their healthcare benefits. They are eating the fat and clothing themselves with the wool.
Or consider it on a policy level. The wealthy using their immense lobbying power to rewrite tax codes and zoning laws to entirely favor their own portfolios, leaving the social safety net, the clean water, and the good pasture completely trampled and muddied for the working class.
I see the parallel, but I have to stop you and push back here. Isn't this just the reality of human nature?
What do you mean?
Well, if you read Thomas Hobbes or look at evolutionary biology, humans are inherently selfish. We are driven by self-preservation and resource hoarding. If you put people in power, the rams are going to use their horns, they're going to eat the fat. That's just the history of the world.
It's a dark view, but it's common.
So my question is it even possible to build systems that don't just reward the most aggressive rams? Are we just destined to repeat this cycle forever?
That is the eternal question, isn't it? The historical context of this text actually agrees with your skepticism about human leaders.
Oh, really?
Yes. The text places its ultimate hope in a divine, perfect king, the messianic servant, precisely because human kings had so completely and catastrophically failed. The ancient author essentially says, humanity can't fix this on its own, God has to intervene.
But we live in a modern democracy. We aren't waiting for a divine monarch to step out of the clouds and run the government. We have to build institutions today.
Exactly. Modern listeners rely on democratic systems, checks and balances, transparency laws, and institutional accountability to try and limit the damage the rams can do. We try to design systems that blunt their horns.
But the standard remains the same.
Right. The enduring moral standard that Ezekiel lays down remains exactly the same, whether you are in an ancient monarchy or a modern republic. True authority is service. In the economy of this text, if your leadership is extractive, it is fundamentally illegitimate. Authority does not exist to enrich the leader, it exists solely to protect the vulnerable.
That completely flips the script on how we view success. We usually view leadership as the reward you get for climbing the ladder. Now you get the corner office and the big paycheck. But this text says the higher you climb, the more you are required to serve.
Which brings the lens right back down to the listener. Because most of us are not geopolitical leaders or Fortune 500 CEOs, but almost all of us have a sphere of influence where we are the ram. We have some form of power.
Right. So if you're listening to this, here's the uncomfortable reflection. Look at your own sphere of influence. Maybe you are a mid-level manager. Maybe you are the head of a family. Maybe you are the veteran player on a sports team. Or you sit on a local community board.
Ask yourself how you're using that power.
Exactly. Are you using your position to eat the fat and secure all the perks for yourself? Or are you actively looking for the marginalized in your group and using your strength to bind up the broken? When you walk away from the watering hole, are you leaving the water clear for the next person? Or are you muddying it to protect your own status?
And that reflection on how we treat the people around us leads us directly into the dark, complicated psychology explored in the next section. We move from internal societal exploitation to how we view our rivals.
Chapter 35.
Right. In chapter 35, Ezekiel delivers a specific, devastating prophecy against Mount Seir, which is the region of Edom.
Let's give some quick family history here because it makes the betrayal so much worse. The Edomites were the descendants of Esau. Esau was the twin brother of Jacob, who was the patriarch of Israel. So these two nations, Israel and Edom, are literal blood relatives.
They share a border and a heritage.
But Edom harbored this perpetual generational hatred for Israel. And when Jerusalem finally fell to the Babylonians, when the Israelites were being slaughtered in the streets and dragged away in chains, Edom didn't send help. They didn't even just stay neutral.
They celebrated. They gloated.
They threw a party, they rejoiced in their neighbors' devastation, and they opportunistically moved in to seize their abandoned land.
Matthew Henry's commentary on this chapter dives deep into the psychology of this betrayal. He notes that Edom's sin wasn't merely political opportunism. It was an insidious, toxic mixture of envy and spite.
Pure spite.
They said, aha, even the ancient high places are ours in possession. They feasted on the misery of their brothers. And because they so deeply love desolation, God's judgment on them is incredibly poetic and severe.
What happens to them?
God promises to make Edom a perpetual desolation. The text explicitly says, since thou hast not hated blood, even blood shall pursue thee.
It's the ultimate boomerang effect. The universe reflects your own toxicity back at you. Let's really dig into the core emotion here, because there's a specific word for it. Schadenfreude.
Schadenfreude, yes.
It's that famous German compound word for the secret joy or the dark thrill of pleasure we feel when someone else experiences misfortune.
It's a fascinating and disturbing psychological phenomenon.
Yeah.
Why does the human brain reward us with pleasure when we see someone else fail?
It's twisted.
It is. Evolutionary psychologists suggest it stems from ancient tribalism and insecure status seeking. In a deeply zero-sum environment, if my rival loses resources or status, my relative status automatically increases without me having to do any work. My brain gives me a dopamine hit because my rival's failure makes me feel safer or superior.
It's a scarcity mindset applied to human dignity. And we have essentially industrialized this in the 21st century. Think about modern cancel culture.
Oh, that's a perfect example.
Now, obviously, holding people accountable for real harm is necessary. But a lot of the internet outrage machine isn't about justice. It's pure, unadulterated schadenfreude. It's the visceral thrill of watching a celebrity, an influencer, or a rival politician fall from grace. We pile on in the comments section because their public humiliation makes us feel morally superior.
We see it in the corporate world, too. The quiet joy when a rival company's stock tanks, or when a coworker who was up for the same promotion as you completely bombs a presentation. We may offer fake sympathy out loud. Oh, that's such a shame. But internally, there's that smirk.
Their high places are ours.
Exactly. And this isn't just an ancient Near Eastern political squabble. If you look at comparative insight, almost every major wisdom tradition identifies this specific emotion as a poison to the human soul.
Really? How so?
Well, in Buddhist philosophy, for example, there is the concept of mudita, which translates to sympathetic or unselfish joy in the good fortune of others. Cultivating mudita is considered the direct antidote to envy and schadenfreude. There is a universal human proverb running through almost all cultures warning against gloating when an enemy falls.
Because it's bad for you?
Exactly. Not just because it's rude, but because it actively corrupts the soul of the one who gloats.
The text is warning us that if you celebrate desolation, you eventually become desolate yourself. You lose your empathy. You lose your humanity. The Edomites thought the fall of Israel meant more land for them, but God's judgment ensured that their spite only brought ruin upon their own heads. The psychological walls they built to keep empathy out ended up becoming their own prison.
So the practical challenge for the listener here is one of deep internal monitoring. You can't necessarily control the initial instinctual flash of an emotion, but you can control what you do with it.
That's the practice.
Right. The next time someone you secretly dislike or a rival you envy faces a public setback, watch your internal reaction. Catch that fleeting moment of schadenfreude. Notice the smirk. And then actively choose to replace it with a moment of empathy. Remind yourself that their destruction does not equal your success. A victory won through someone else's misery is a poisoned chalice.
But let's be honest, changing our deepest, ugliest internal reactions, like turning schadenfreude into empathy, requires way more than just a little bit of willpower.
It takes a miracle, practically.
It's not just a matter of trying harder. And that realization is exactly what the author addresses in Chapter 36, which details what I can only call an inside-out transformation.
Chapter 36 is arguably one of the most profound, theologically dense chapters in the entire book. God promises a stunning physical restoration for the desolate land of Israel. He says the ruined cities will be rebuilt, the ground will yield tremendous fruit, the famine will end.
But that's not the main point.
No, the text makes it very clear that this physical, environmental restoration is secondary. It's almost the byproduct of a much deeper spiritual and psychological restoration.
The core of the chapter outlines a radical internal surgery. The text says, I will sprinkle clean water upon you and you shall be clean. But then it goes deeper into the anatomy. God says, a new heart also will I give you, and a new spirit will I put within you. And I just take away the stony heart out of your flesh, and I will give you a heart of flesh.
And finally, I will put my spirit within you and cause you to walk in my statutes.
It's a complete paradigm shift. Why this sudden, desperate move to internal surgery?
Because historically speaking, behavior modification had entirely failed.
Yes, the Israelites had the law, they had the 10 Commandments, they had the rules written in literal stone, they had a complex system of rewards and punishments.
And the prophets had been blowing the trumpets for centuries.
The environment had been manipulated in every possible way to encourage good behavior, and none of it worked. They still ended up worshiping idols and exploiting the poor.
The law on stone tablets couldn't change them because their hearts were made of stone. The text uses that metaphor to describe a state of being rigid, unresponsive, calcified. They were dead to empathy, dead to divine connection.
So shouting at them wouldn't work.
No. You can shout at a stone all day, you can threaten it, you can offer it rewards, but it cannot respond. The only solution left is a fundamental change of desires.
Let me offer an analogy that might make this click for a modern listener. Think about trying to run a brand new, highly complex software program on a corrupted, outdated computer hard drive from 1998.
Oh boy.
The software represents the good laws, the positive habits, the new behaviors you want to implement. You try to install it, the computer freezes, you restart it, you try to force quit other applications, you yell at the screen, you threaten to throw the computer out the window.
No bull there.
But none of that behavior modification works because the hardware itself is fundamentally flawed. You can't try harder to make it run. You need a completely new operating system. You need the motherboard replaced. That is the heart of flesh.
That is a perfect analogy.
Yeah.
But there is a significant obstacle in this text, something that is going to severely rub a modern listener the wrong way. Ezekiel states very clearly, multiple times in this chapter, that God is doing this internal surgery not because the people deserve it.
He's very clear about that.
Very. God says, not for your sakes do I this, be ashamed and confounded for your own ways. Instead, God says he is doing this for his own holy name's sake.
Right. And to a modern listener, steeped in the language of self-esteem, meritocracy, and intrinsic self-worth, that sounds incredibly offensive.
It does.
We hear that and think, wow, God sounds incredibly egocentric. He's only saving us to protect his own brand reputation. What about my value? Doesn't he love me for me?
It sounds harsh to modern ears, but it requires deep discernment to reframe this. If you put on the ancient theological lens, this statement isn't about God's ego. It is actually the ultimate expression of grace. Think about the logic. If the restoration of Israel was based on the people's merit, they would be utterly hopeless. They had no merit. They had failed every test. They were rebellious, idolatrous, and they had profaned the name of God among the nations. If God's rescue mission depended on their worthiness, they would remain in exile in Babylon forever.
Oh, I see. By saying I'm doing this for my name's sake, God is actively taking the burden of worthiness completely off their shoulders.
Exactly. It means human failure does not exhaust divine love. God's character is the absolute guarantee of their salvation, not their own fragile perfection. You don't have to earn the new heart. In fact, you can't earn it.
That's a total gift.
It is a gift based entirely on the giver's unchanging nature. It is an act of sovereign, unmerited grace. The clean water, the new spirit, it is all initiated and completed by the divine, precisely because the human capacity to heal itself is fundamentally broken.
That is incredibly liberating. It takes the crushing pressure of perfectionism off the table. How many times do we try to force behavioral change in our lives using a stony heart approach? We use guilt, shame, or sheer exhausting willpower to stop a bad habit, to lose weight, or to fix a fractured relationship.
We white-knuckle our way through life.
And we fail, and then we hate ourselves for failing. The text is saying, stop trying to rewrite the software without upgrading the hard drive. Stop relying on shame, and start seeking a fundamental shift in your affections and desires. Ask for the heart of flesh.
And once you understand that profound need for a new heart on an individual level, the text naturally scales up. What does that internal resurrection look like on a macro scale?
Now we're getting into the really famous imagery.
Yes. What happens when an entire society needs to be brought back from the dead? That brings us to chapter 37, which features the famous vision of the Valley of Dry Bones and the subsequent message about the power of unity.
This is undoubtedly the most cinematic, famous vision in the entire book of Ezekiel. The prophet is taken in the spirit and set down in the middle of a valley. And the valley is just filled with human bones. The text is very specific to note two things. There are very many bones, and they are very dry.
Very dry.
God asks Ezekiel a seemingly impossible, almost rhetorical question. Son of man, can these bones live?
And Ezekiel gives a very careful, politically savvy answer. He says, O Lord God, thou knowest. He doesn't presume to know the limits of divine power, but he also looks at the reality on the ground and doesn't pretend it looks likely.
Then God commands Ezekiel to prophesy, to speak out loud to the bones. As he speaks, there is a noise, there's a rattling, a shaking, and the bones start coming together, bone to bone. Then sinews and flesh cover them, and skin covers the flesh.
But they're still just lying there.
Right. They are perfectly formed corpses. There is no breath in them. So God tells Ezekiel a second time, prophesy to the wind or the breath. The breath comes into them, and they stand up on their feet, an exceedingly great army.
This vision is not just a cool special effect. It is a direct, targeted answer to the despair of the exiles in Babylon. We noted earlier how depressed they were. They were literally walking around the camp saying, our bones are dried and our hope is lost. We are cut off for our parts.
They felt like those bones.
Exactly. The commentator Albert Barnes highlights that the bones being very dry represents absolute generational hopelessness. It is total institutional and national death. The fact that the bones are scattered and unburied also implies they were the victims of a violent, shameful defeat left to bleach in the sun.
But I have to push the envelope here, because as beautiful as this imagery is, it is so easy to read this vision as a piece of toxically positive, don't worry, everything will magically be okay inspiration.
Like a motivational poster.
Right. Just believe enough, and your dry bones will live. But the text says the bones were dry. They had been dead a long time. The decay was complete. How does a modern person practically apply this when a situation in their life, maybe a dead marriage, a bankrupt business, or even our incredibly fractured, polarized modern society, looks completely, empirically, undeniably dead? Are we just supposed to sit back and wait for a magical win?
That is the crucial tension of the text. The translation of this ancient vision into modern reality is about how we overcome profound despair. And it emphatically demands active participation. That is the key.
Ezekiel had to do something.
Ezekiel didn't just sit on the edge of the cliff and watch God perform a magic trick in the valley. He was commanded to speak. He had to open his mouth and declare truth over a situation that looked, to his physical eyes, utterly hopeless.
He had to sound a bit crazy doing it.
Probably. He had to prophesy to the bones, and then he had to prophesy to the wind. Human agency and divine power were partnered.
So the lesson is that we have to participate in the resurrection. We have to speak hope into the void, even when we feel ridiculous doing it. But the chapter doesn't end with just the army standing up. There is a second object lesson that follows immediately, and I think it's even more relevant to us today.
The 2 sticks.
Yes! God tells Ezekiel to take 2 wooden sticks. On one stick, he writes Judah, which represents the southern kingdom of Israel. On the other stick, he writes Joseph, or Ephraim, representing the northern kingdom.
This requires a bit of historical context. These 2 nations, the North and the South, had been locked in a bitter, bloody, intractable civil war for centuries. They hated each other.
Deeply.
And God tells Ezekiel to take these 2 sticks and join them together in his hands so they become one single stick.
Healing division requires more than just bringing people back to life. You can have a valley full of breathing, living people, but if they are still holding on to the bitter animosities of the past, they aren't a restored nation. They are just a mob waiting for the next civil war to start.
Precisely. The 2 sticks represent the healing of deep historical systemic grievances. Bringing those 2 warring factions together into one hand requires both a supernatural intervention and a massive human willingness to drop old weapons.
So they have to choose peace.
The text promises that under the one shepherd again, that messianic figure, the divisions will cease. The breath of life must be followed by the covenant of peace, or the resurrection is pointless.
Think about the polarization in our society right now. We are so divided along political, racial, and economic lines. We are living in a valley of 2 sticks. So the challenge for you, the listener, is this. Identify one dry bone situation in your life or in your community. A relationship that seems dead, a societal divide that seems unbridgeable.
You ask yourself what you can do.
Instead of just accepting its death, what is one word of truth, forgiveness, or hope you can actively speak over it this week? How can you do the hard, uncomfortable work of holding the two sticks together in your own hands?
And as we move into the final section of our deep dive, we have to acknowledge a harsh reality. Resurrection, new hearts, and unity do not mean the end of all conflict.
Oh, definitely not.
In fact, flourishing often attracts new, massive threats. This brings us to chapters 38 and 39, the ultimate conflict and the repurposing of weapons.
This part of the text always feels like a shock to the system. Just when you think the story's wrapping up with a neat, happy ending, the people are back in the land, they have a new heart of flesh, the dry bones are an army, the north and south are united suddenly, the sky darkens, a massive new threat appears on the horizon. The text describes an apocalyptic battle against an enemy named Gog of the land of Magog.
Gog represents a massive, opportunistic confederacy of foreign nations. They look down and see that Israel has been restored. And they notice that Israel is living peacefully in what the text calls unwalled villages.
Meaning they aren't expecting an attack.
Exactly. Meaning Israel is secure, resting in God's protection, and they've let their guard down. Gog's motivation isn't a complex political ideology. It is pure predatory greed and malice. Gog says, I will go up to the land of unwalled villages. I will go to them that are at rest, to take a spoil, and to take a prey.
It's the ultimate ambush. You finally get your life together and then boom, you get hit by a freight train. But before Gog's massive army can even strike a meaningful blow, God dramatically, overwhelmingly intervenes.
It's a massive show of force.
The text describes a cosmic reaction. Massive earthquakes, mountains literally falling down, pestilence and fire raining down from heaven. Gog's army is completely obliterated by divine power. The Israelites don't even have to draw a sword.
Now, we need to pause here because there's a massive obstacle when modern readers approach these specific chapters. We have to use extreme discernment. For centuries, well-meaning people have gotten totally lost in apocalyptic conspiracy theories with this text.
Oh yeah, trying to figure out who Gog is today.
Right. They try to map Gog and Magog onto specific modern geopolitical nations. During the Cold War, Gog was the Soviet Union. Today, people say it's Russia or China or a Middle Eastern coalition.
People try to read Ezekiel 38 like it's a newspaper predicting World War III. They've got push pins and red string on a map.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And the commentary by Albert Barnes strongly urges us to avoid that literalistic trap. This is highly symbolic, apocalyptic, prophetic literature. It does not represent a specific, literal modern nation. Instead, it represents a profound theological and historical truth.
Which is?
The ultimate, inevitable clash between systemic evil and divine justice. The lesson isn't about identifying a nation on a map. The lesson is that as good flourishes, it will inevitably attract opposition. Evil is real, it hates flourishing, and it will make a desperate final stand.
I like to compare this to the climax of a movie. You know the trope. The hero has seemingly won, the main conflict is resolved, peace is assured, the soaring orchestral music swells, and then bam, the villain lunges out of the shadows for one final, desperate, terrifying jump scare attack.
Yes, the classic jump scare.
But what makes Ezekiel's account so unique is that he doesn't just focus on the dramatic fire and brimstone defeat of the villain. He focuses heavily on the massive, tedious cleanup operation afterward.
That is easily the most striking and unexpected part of these chapters. The aftermath is described in granular detail. After Gog is destroyed, Israel spends 7 entire years burning the leftover weapons of Gog's army for fuel.
7 years of firewood.
Right. They don't take the shields, bows, and spears and put them in an armory to build up their own military. They chop them up and burn them to keep their houses warm and cook their food. And then they spend 7 full months meticulously burying the dead enemy soldiers to cleanse the land from defilement.
It is the ultimate swords into plowshares moment. They are literally repurposing the tools of death to sustain life. They are taking the exact instruments that were forged to destroy them and using them to heat their living rooms. The trauma of the invasion is transformed into fuel for their future.
It reveals a profound cosmic irony. Evil is ultimately self-defeating under the sovereign hand of justice. The very resources the enemy brought to annihilate the community are ultimately used to provide for them. The massive cleanup operation is a holy work of purification, ensuring that the land, which represents the restored community, is completely free from the taint of death. It's a statement that the victory isn't just about surviving, it's about completely neutralizing the trauma.
It's such a powerful, resonant image. So let's bring this home to the listener right now. Think about the Gog moments in your own life. I'm talking about those times when you've done the grueling internal work. You've gotten the new heart, you've healed a broken relationship, you are finally living in a place of peace, your own unwalled village, and suddenly a massive, unexpected challenge attacks you out of nowhere.
A health crisis, a sudden job loss.
Exactly, a betrayal. When that happens, do you panic and think all your progress was fake? Do you assume the universe is just out to get you? Or do you trust that the ultimate victory belongs to the good? Can you look at that crisis and ask, how can I chop this up and use it for firewood? How can I let this challenge fuel my growth, my empathy, and my resilience?
It requires a profound, hard-won shift in perspective to look at a weapon forged against you and see future firewood. But that is the promise of the text.
Wow. Okay, we have covered a massive, emotionally dense amount of ground today. Let's synthesize this journey we've taken through the exile. We started with the heavy, terrifying individual responsibility of the watchman, realizing we must have the courage to blow the trumpet, but also the self-awareness to break the lovely song Illusion, where we treat life or death wisdom like a podcast playlist.
We then scaled up to the systemic level, critiquing the selfish shepherds and the aggressive rams who exploit the vulnerable, reminding us that true authority is defined by protection, not extraction. We warned against the toxic, corrosive snare of Edom's schadenfreude, the secret joy in another's ruin.
From there, we went deep inside, recognizing that our attempts at behavior modification will always fail without the internal, surgical grace of a new heart and a new spirit. And that internal change is what allows for the macro resurrection. The valley of dry bones standing up, and the broken, warring sticks being joined together in a unified covenant of peace.
And finally, we face the reality that true flourishing will always attract opposition. But the ultimate conflict ends not just in the dramatic defeat of evil, but in the slow, intentional repurposing of its weapons for warmth, provision, and life.
It is a breathtaking narrative arc, from the ashes of Jerusalem to a restored people burning the weapons of their enemies to stay warm.
And we'll leave the listener with a final thought to mull over as you step back into your daily routine. We've spent a lot of time talking about ancient prophecies, soaring visions, and divine interventions. But what if the dry bones in our modern world aren't just waiting for a miraculous magical wind from the sky?
What if they're waiting for us?
Exactly. What if they are waiting for us to step up and finally start being the watchmen? To stop playing toxic zero-sum games with our neighbors, to do the hard, deeply uncomfortable work of holding the broken sticks of our society together in our own hands, and to be brave enough to repurpose our own weapons, our anger, our defenses, our sharp edges into tools for warmth and life.
That's the heart of this section. This is Wisdom for the Present, where understanding leads to clarity, and clarity shapes how we see and live. We'll see you in the next episode.